Hello, Jeff Zwarnik here, and welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more confident in sharing your faith. And today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Ken Samples, and we're going to address the question, what kind of world does science need to work? Ken, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
You know, I remember at least one conversation that you and I have had. We were talking about how you do things and talking about science, and I remember making a statement to you that, well, science just works. And we ended up having an interesting conversation about that. But I've come to appreciate in talking with you that science actually needs some things to work. And so I'll kind of throw that question out to you. What kind of world does science need to work?
Yeah, I like to talk about what I call a science-conducive world. I mean, there has to be a real world. It can't be illusory. The world has to express design. It has to have order in it. It can't be a disorderly chaos.
So these are the sorts of things that are kind of getting to, you know, for science, you're looking at orderly, repeatability, regularity, patterns type things. And so You've got to have a world that actually that allows that to be studied, if you will.
Yeah, and science relies on mathematics, on logic, and that there is a coherence between the human mind and the world. And so there's a lot of things that actually have to operate quite delicately for science to work.
So, I mean, some of that seems a little ridiculous to almost think otherwise. I mean, you know, the idea that our minds can comprehend what's going in, that just seems kind of, well, duh. Seems kind of basic. I mean, why would we even think otherwise in that?
You know, Paul Davies, the famous cosmologist, has said that the universe could have been a disorderly chaos rather than an orderly cosmos. And if there's no God, and if our brain is the result of blind mechanistic natural processes, there's no guarantee that our cognitive faculties and sensory organs would work effectively. So it is a delicate balance, and I think it makes more sense in that kind of world if God is behind it.
Yeah, it seems to be very critical. I mean, if there weren't the orderliness or our ability to comprehend, in a very real sense, we would never probably have come up with science. I mean, there would be no reason to, if you will.
I think that, you know, science has a strong connection historically to Christianity because the early Christians thought we can do science. We're made in the image of God. God is an orderly creator. So I think it facilitated the advance of science.
Again, why would we think differently about that? I mean, or what would give us motivation to think differently about that?
Well, certainly if you turn to the East, if you turn to kind of Eastern mystical philosophy, Hinduism, the universe may be God's body. It may be illusory. It may be what Hindus call Maya. But there's also, even in the Western world, I mean, there is these kind of mystical discussions about quantum mechanics where maybe, you know, the observer influences the effects. So it's not necessarily taken for granted.
So it seems to me that this, you know, we talk about does the Bible line up with what the Bible describes of creation line up with what we find scientifically. But it seems like what we're describing here gives us a capacity to even test which worldviews are correct. Because, you know, say you take, the Greek mythology, if you will, there's a worldview where there's all these different gods and kind of what's going on in the world is a battle between the gods.
Right.
That doesn't seem a worldview particularly conducive to science working, if you will. Is this a way we can test worldviews and which ones are right?
I think it is, and I don't think it's just kind of the ancient cosmologies. I mean, I've met secular scientists who give the impression that science is practiced without any reference to worldview implications, and that's just simply not true. Just as I've illustrated, you have a lot of assumptions that you begin with. You don't prove them in science. You might confirm them, but they're assumptions you begin with.
And where about, I mean, I think you're right. Where do we get these assumptions? I mean, we assume there's order and regularity, but by looking at it, we find it in some sense, but would that be a test that, well, okay, it's just kind of self-validating, if you will?
Well, I think in one sense, science is very dependent upon Western ideas, and those Western ideas are influenced by Judeo-Christian ideas. And so the idea that the universe is orderly, that humans have these remarkable faculties, fits pretty well with a Judeo-Christian perspective of theology.
So as we look at it, is the Judeo-Christian way of looking at the world the only one that matches this? Or do many of them match up? I mean, how well does what's your assessment on how well do the different worldviews line up? Or what kind of world do we need from a worldview perspective?
I think that's a fair question. I'm not saying that other worldviews may not get some of these kinds of things right. But I think the worldview assumptions that are needed to do science have come out of a biblical context, and I think they fit better overall in a Christian theistic perspective.
Does this mean that you need to be a Christian in order to do science well?
No, there have been many great scientists who were not Jewish or not Christian or not religious at all. But of course, they're kind of jumping on the train as it's moving. I would say it's the worldview implications that kind of birthed science and allowed it to flourish.
So it's not so much that you need to be a Christian today, but in some sense you needed a Christian worldview in order to get the scientific enterprise going, if you will.
And I think that non-Christian scientists, to some extent, are borrowing Judeo-Christian ideas in doing science.
Ken, I really appreciate your comments. I think they're powerful and very probative, if you will.
Thank you.
When we look at the world, there are a lot of things that we just take for granted because of how well science works. But when we ask the question, why does science work? What kind of world is needed for science to work? We find that the one described in Scripture, the Judeo-Christian worldview, actually anchors the philosophical underpinnings of science. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Ken's article on this. What kind of world does science need to work to help equip you to use this powerful, probative, fascinating way of studying the universe so that we can tell others about who God is and how He sent His Son to save us?